I'm Julie Stellan for Forum Daily Week in Review. Last week, Reuters broke the news that the World Health Organization's Cancer Research Agency, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, plans to declare the artificial sweetener aspartame a possible carcinogen. The move would drastically alter the food service industry, as this classification would indicate to consumers that aspartame could cause cancer. However, some big questions still remain. How likely is it that aspartame actually causes cancer? And how much diet pop would you have to drink to increase your cancer risk? Joining us now to discuss the potential link between aspartame and cancer is Bill Wirtz, journalist and senior policy analyst with the Consumer Choice Center. Given the agency's plan to reclassify the substance, should consumers be worried about aspartame?
No, they shouldn't be. Aspartame has been a safe sweetener that has been approved in Canada and many other jurisdictions since about the 1980s. So there's about 200 studies that show the safety of aspartame as a sweetener. And actually, I think the debate is a little silly that has been started by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, because it distracts us from the actual problem that we were trying to solve with sweeteners, which is sugar. People should be reducing their sugar intake, and this has been the way to do it. And also, sweeteners are very important if you're, for instance, a diabetic. So no, people should not be concerned about the intake of aspartame.
So if aspartame is relatively harmless, why does the IARC classify it as a possible carcinogen?
So the reason that the International Agency for Research on Cancer does a different classification than literally every other health body in the world is because they take a different approach to assessing harm. So here we get into sort of, I think this is interesting for your audience, the difference between hazard and risk. So in the English language, hazard and risk are these are trivial differences between those two words. But in science, it does make a significant difference. Hazard is the potential that something can harm you. Risk is the likelihood that it will. So just to illustrate this for you, during the summer, you go out in the sun, and the sun is a hazard because it can cause a sunburn or you can get a sunstroke. But the way consumers manage that risk is by reducing the exposure or applying sunscreen. So this is why it is a hazard, but not a risk. And so in this instance, what we have to look at is the actual exposure. Like, what is the dosage that would be problematic for you? And in the case of aspartame, a person with the weight of about 60 kilograms would have to drink 12 to 36 cans of Diet Coke a day for an extended period of time. And my take is, if you drink that much Diet Coke, you might have a few other problems as well.
What else has the IARC given a 2B classification to?
Yeah, so the classifications are interesting. So there's 4 classifications, number 1 and 3. So there's this 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. 1 and 3 are the strong evidence ones. So number 1 is all the things that can cause cancer, that we know cause cancer. And number 3 is the one that we know do not cause cancer. 2A and 2B are a bit more ambiguous because both of them are described as possibly and probably. And they do quite a lot of heavy lifting in there. So for instance, in 2B, you have pickled Asian vegetables. So if you're enjoying kimchi, that is also a high carcinogenic risk. And actually, a higher carcinogenic risk is what I'm doing with you right now. As you can see in my background, it's already dark. I am in Europe, and working at night is considered 2A on the carcinogenic risk level for people. So I think what we're doing here is sort of blurring the line on risk perception for consumers.
What would happen health-wise if consumers shifted back to drinks that are not artificially sweetened?
So if you tell consumers that aspartame causes cancer, because a lot of consumers will just read the headline, they will do one of 2 things. Either they will say, well, aspartame is very dangerous, I'm going back to sugar. And that's the problem we were trying to solve in the first place, for people not to consume as much sugar in their sweet drinks. Or what they can also do is they might conclude, look, if aspartame causes cancer and cigarettes cause cancer, well then, maybe all of this is a bit overblown and cigarettes are actually not that bad for me. So by relativizing those risks, we're actually giving consumers a very bad perception on the actual risk factors that surround them. Because let's be honest, a lot of people saw this news, they just saw the headline, and now they're ditching their diet soda, which is actually not what this should be about.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
After the break, we'll be looking at a new report published in Housing, which says home building costs are up 51% from 2020. Our interview with Eric Lombardi from More Neighbors Toronto up next. The cost of building a home in Canada has never been higher, according to economists at RBC. The cost to build a home in Canada has gotten 51% more expensive over the last 3 years. According to their report published last week, much of the 51% increase in home building costs comes from soaring prices for steel, concrete, and lumber, along with rising labor costs and disruptions from extreme weather. Given the current state of Canada's housing market, economists and advocates have argued that this couldn't come at a worse time, right when provincial and municipal governments are seeking to ramp up home building. Joining us now to discuss how the cost to build a home impacts the housing market is Eric Lombardi, the founder of More Neighbors Toronto. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on. A pleasure to be here.
So we hear a lot about how zoning impacts the availability of housing, but we don't hear much about actual construction costs. How much of an impact do you think construction costs have on final home prices in comparison to other factors?
I think they have a significant cost, but I think the important thing for listeners to keep in mind here is that this is a system and all of these things have an impact on one another. So public policy around zoning and the rules to build housing impacts the ability and the incentives on labor, materials, and everything that you need to put into a home as well.
Are there outside factors as to why construction costs have soared, or are those increases in line with overall inflation?
Those key increases are not quite in line with overall inflation. We did have quite a supply shock through COVID, particularly to the movement of goods, especially lumber, over that period of time. And that did accelerate costs as well as the impacts to recover those things, especially when fuel prices spiked. And so a lot of those costs that during that time are baked into current prices. The other factor that we are facing right now is higher interest rates, which is just increasing the cost of capital for investing and building up of inventory. And so that's actually raising the costs for the industry as well.
So if it costs more to build a home, one would assume that this discourages building. Are we seeing rising construction costs impact housing starts?
I think we are, but I think the mix of factors that are influencing this is all converging at the same moment in a very bad way for the production of new housing. Every time that you raise the price of inputs to housing, whether that be through materials and labor, or you do it through escalating land values or government taxes, fees, and processes costs, you raise the floor that a builder needs to pencil for that unit. And if the prices in the market can't sustain that floor, you're going to see less building overall. And so all of these things that add to the cost of a net new unit of housing influence whether or not we're going to build enough of it, particularly to meet the needs of our vastly and dramatically growing population.
Is the slowing down of housing starts a big problem for increasing supply, or is a slowdown cyclical?
I don't necessarily think this is cyclical. I think what we're experiencing now from a supply perspective means that prices years from now are really going to accelerate in ways that we've seen in the past, adding on top to the cost pressures that we're seeing from an affordability standpoint. So everything that we're seeing right now is just downstream of an escalating problem where the trend does not look good over the long term.
So in your opinion, what are some of the best policies that can be enacted to calm the housing affordability crisis?
I think we need to address public policy around zoning and land use reform. We have a pretty bizarre way that we build out our cities in the GTA and Canada generally, where we see very dense nodes of highly complex projects, that 20, 30, 40 stories. They take 5 to 10 years to build, and they're very engineering intensive per square foot that gets produced. They do produce a lot of smaller units, generally speaking, but it's still an expensive cost to bear. The other way that we've grown is that we've seen sprawling single-family homes, et cetera, where you can build a lot lower at a cost per square foot perspective, but you don't produce a lot of units. And so public policy influences whether or not we can build what many call the missing middle. That is, the 4 to 8 story multiplexes to small apartment buildings that can be produced using less costly materials on faster timelines, so there's lower cost of capital and less risk. And you can leverage and have labor specialize even better to produce housing. So when we look at those policies, it doesn't just affect the price of land, it actually affects the ability for the industry's velocity to build net new housing and net new space with the resources it does have.
Canada is currently experiencing a healthcare shortage, and that is especially true for nurses. Consistently, we have heard from nurses who are exhausted from stretched working conditions, excessive workloads, understaffing, and overtime requirements. And all of that was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. The nursing shortage leaves us asking some very big questions. How can our healthcare system improve to make better working conditions for nurses? How can we fill the nursing shortage domestically? Or do we need to rely on international talent to fill the void? And lastly, what are the real world consequences when nurses are overworked? Joining us now to unpack this is Dr. Sylvain Brousseau, President of the Canadian Nurses Association. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
How is the shortage impacting nurses, and what can be done to improve retention?
First of all, the shortage is impacting everyone, nurses, physicians, and other as well healthcare professionals, and as well, I would say the patient, because without nurses in the healthcare system, there is no healthcare services and there is no access to the care services in hospital, emergency, in primary care as well. And that's why it's important to, to implement the measure of retention. You need to improve the working condition of nurses, make sure that they are working in a safe place. And nurses have expressed that in some cases they work in an environment that it's not it's toxic in some places. I would say that it's not everywhere, but there are some places nurses are fed up of the situation and working always in understaffing and being always in workload pressure and asking them to stay like 16, 18, 20, and even 24 hours at work. I mean, this is not sustainable for the healthcare system. And as well for the quality and safety care, because if you always work overtime shift, eventually there is a risk of error, and who will have an impact on? It's the patient. And it's time to implement the solution, because solutions are there. And I always say to politicians, you must respect and listen to nurses' solution, because nurses they have talent, they have expertise, they know how we can resolve this. And it's important that we invest in the nursing retention measure, such as making sure that you have a better patient ratio by nurses, improve the working condition, to maintain nurses who are in the healthcare system actually, and to make sure that the one who left come back inside the healthcare system, and the one who entered into the nursing workforce in hospital and other areas of the healthcare, such as the long-term care, primary care, that they have all the support to integrate them inside the healthcare system. Make sure also that nurses are paid, the wage paid, being paid at the level of the nursing competencies. And we must improve the work environment. And it seems to be I would say, a kind of implementation crisis, such as André Picard said recently in the media. And if we don't act now, that's going to have an impact in short term in the healthcare system. And we see what's happened last year when we saw emergency being closed, some obstetrician room being closed as well in some places across the country. And you have the one as well who are living in rural and community areas such as up north. I mean, we need to resolve this once and for all.
We have just a minute left, but I do want to ask for those vacancies. Some argue that we need to fill those spots with international talent. Do you feel that this could help solve the nursing shortage? And give me about 45 seconds.
Yes. Can we use the one? Can we resolve the international educated nurses who are already in Canada and don't practice right now? And we need to focus first on those, make sure that we reduce the bureaucracy and assess their requests and move forward.
Dr. Sylvain Brousseau, President of the Canadian Nurses Association, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Have a great day.
When we return, we will be shifting our focus to the latest developments in Hong Kong. Hong Kong officials have demanded that dissidents living abroad should turn themselves in for prosecution. Our interview with Dr. Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, is coming up after the break, so stay with us. Hong Kong's leader is calling for 8 pro-democracy activists living abroad to surrender after they were charged with alleged national security offenses. The activists, including 3 former lawmakers, now live in Canada, the US, the UK, and Australia. They are all accused of breaching the Beijing-imposed national security law enacted in 2020 as part of a crackdown on dissent. Conservative MP Michael Chong says his party condemns the arrest warrants, and the diaspora community in Canada is concerned that this could set a very dangerous precedent. Joining us now to discuss this is Dr. Charles Burton, China expert and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. This is obviously a concerning development for those dissidents who reside in Canada. What would happen to these people if they were to turn themselves in? What sort of punishment would they be subject to?
Well, I mean, there would be a trial, but based on the national security law, which covers a very broad definition of calling for secession of Hong Kong from China or subversion or foreign collusion, they would surely be found guilty and could be sentenced to quite a long period of incarceration in a prison facility, even possibly transferred over to mainland China. So, this is a very serious matter. The issue here is that anybody in Canada could be subject to this law because the national security law of Hong Kong covers activities undertaken by people outside of Hong Kong. So it has an extraterritorial aspect to it. So, even our conversation today could, in theory, make us violators of a Hong Kong law and subject to extradition back to China if we were pursued and decided to visit countries that have active extradition treaties with Hong Kong at this time.
Beyond the 8 dissidents that Hong Kong's leader has named, how could this impact the Chinese-Canadian community in Canada? Could Communist Party officials in China use the same tactics to target others who have been critical of the regime in Beijing?
Absolutely. I think that is the concern of all of us, is that we get charged with something based on Chinese law for activities that we have undertaken outside of China. I mean, for example, say demonstrating in front of the Chinese embassy, calling for sanctions against Chinese officials who have violated the universal norms of international human rights or something like that. And then if we went on holiday someplace that has an active extradition treaty, say Thailand, that theoretically we could be arrested while abroad and then transmitted to China for trial and a long period of incarceration. We haven't seen that yet, but the possibility exists. And I think this latest development in putting a bounty of $1 million Hong Kong dollars onto 8 very well-known, very respected democracy activists who are currently in self-exile abroad is a chilling indication that we might see China becoming much more proactive in addressing people inside Canada who are critical of the current Chinese regime. And that would, of course, include Canadian parliamentarians like Michael Chong.
And what does this mean in regards to Canada's growing problem of foreign interference? Is this yet another example of the Beijing regime attempting to extend beyond its borders?
Absolutely. I mean, this law explicitly says that people can be found guilty for statements or activities undertaken abroad. So it's as if Chinese sovereignty doesn't really matter. And, you know, that anybody who offends China because China doesn't really abide by genuine due process of law could be subject to false allegations and charges inside China, and then potentially subject to extradition from other countries back to China to face these really unanswerable charges. So, you know, this is part and parcel of a process that we're seeing of China exerting its authority in foreign countries, including our discovery that China has these police stations inside Canada, and China's activities to try and influence our democratic process by illegally supporting certain candidates and expounding disinformation about candidates that they don't like. So it's a very disturbing trend that I think our government has to take much more seriously than we have up to now.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
I'm Julie Stellan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you can always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter for updates. Thanks for joining us on the Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you again next time. Take care.